They said New Orleans would never drown behind its 350 miles of levees. August 24, 2005, officials promised the city could survive any storm. Yet experts warned that half the city lay up to 10 feet below sea level, vulnerable by design. Internal memos revealed shortcut engineering, the steel meant to anchor flood walls buried just 17 feet deep, not nearly enough. As the water rose, every reassurance turned deadly. How did a city built on faith in its own defenses become the site of America's most avoidable flood? New Orleans has always been a city that defies geography. Spread along the Mississippi River Delta, much of its land sits 6 to 10 feet below sea level, pressed between the river and Lake Pontchartrain. For generations, the only thing holding back disaster was a network of levees and flood walls stretching over 350 miles, an engineering promise that the city could outsmart nature. After Hurricane Betsy in 1965 left neighborhoods underwater and hundreds of lives lost, the federal government poured resources into building what was called the Hurricane Protection System. Concrete walls rose along the city's outfall canals, and steel sheet pilings were driven into the earth to anchor these defenses. Residents were told that the new system could withstand the worst the Gulf could deliver. By the summer of 2005, this belief was more than just hope, it was official policy. On August 24th, just days before Katrina entered the Gulf, Mayor Ray Nagin stood before cameras and reassured everyone that the city was ready. Officials repeated the message. New Orleans was protected. The levees would hold. Local news ran stories on the city's preparedness, quoting engineers and city leaders who insisted that the system had been tested and improved since Betsy. The Army Corps of Engineers, the agency responsible for the levees, described their work as state-of-the-art. The city's flood walls, they claimed, were designed for a Category 3 hurricane, but the confidence ran deeper than public statements. For many, the levees were more than concrete and steel. They were a guarantee. Homeowners in Lakeview, Gentilly, and the lower Ninth Ward built lives in the shadow of these walls, trusting that the lessons of the past had been learned. Insurance policies, mortgages, and city planning all relied on the assumption that the water would be held back. People moved into neighborhoods below sea level, watched their children walk to schools built on reclaimed land, and lived with the quiet assurance that the city's defenses were as strong as the promises behind them. Yet beneath this confidence, the city's true vulnerability was always present. The ground continued to sink, the levees settled, and every hurricane season brought uneasy reminders of the city's precarious position. The promise of safety was repeated year after year, even as new warnings surfaced. But in August 2005, as a storm gathered strength in the Gulf, New Orleans remained certain that the water would stay on the other side of the wall. Warnings about New Orleans' levees system had been circulating for years, buried in technical reports and internal memos. In offices at LSU's Hurricane Center, Dr. Ivor Van Heerden and his team ran simulations that showed a chilling scenario. A major hurricane could breach the city's flood walls, flooding nearly everything between the river and the lake. Their models didn't just predict water overtopping the walls, they showed the walls themselves collapsing, long before the city's defenses should have failed. The Army Corps of Engineers' own documents echoed these concerns. In the early 1990s, engineers had recommended driving steel sheet pilings as deep as 40 feet to anchor the canal floodwalls. But after a series of load tests in 1993, the Corps approved a change. The piles would go only 17 feet deep, less than half the original recommendation. This shortcut saved millions of dollars, but also cut the safety factor to around 0.5, a margin so thin that a strong surge could push the walls over like dominoes. The Corps' internal memos flagged the risk, warning that the soft soils beneath the city might not hold. The design was supposed to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, but the calculations depended on perfect conditions, not the unpredictable layers of peat and sand that lay hidden underneath. The danger wasn't just theoretical. In July 2004, more than 250 experts from FEMA, the Army Corps, and LSU gathered for a tabletop exercise called Hurricane PAM. The scenario they built was eerily close to what would unfold just a year later. A slow-moving storm, massive rainfall, and levees breached in multiple places. Their projections showed much of New Orleans underwater, with neighborhood after neighborhood cut off by rising floodwaters. The exercise mapped out the need for mass evacuations, rooftop rescues, and emergency shelters, plans that would later prove vital, but only if acted upon. Despite these warnings, funding for follow-up work stalled. FEMA's promised contracts for emergency supplies went unfulfilled. Local agencies struggled to finalize search and rescue protocols. The detailed plans produced by Hurricane Pam sat unfinished, and the technical doubts about the levee system remained largely unaddressed. On paper, the risks were clear. In practice, the city's fate depended on a system built on shortcuts and wishful thinking. Wind howled over the city as Hurricane Katrina made landfall at 6:10 a.m. on August 29, 2005. The storm surge pressed against the levees with a force that had never been tested in real conditions. Within the first hour, the east side of the Industrial Canal gave way. Water roared into the lower 9th Ward, tearing homes from their foundations and sending entire blocks adrift. By 6:30 a.m., power failed across New Orleans. The outfall canals, 17th Street, London Avenue, Orleans Avenue, shuddered under the weight of rising water. At 7 a.m., more breaches opened along the Industrial Canal's west side, flooding neighborhoods from St. Claude to St. Roch. By 7:30, both sides of the London Avenue Canal collapsed. Gently, a neighborhood once promised protection by concrete and steel filled like a bowl. At 8:30, water overtopped the Orleans Avenue Canal, pushing into City Park. The real blow struck at 9 a.m. when a massive breach tore open the 17th Street Canal. Lakeview, a community built on trust in the levees, was swallowed as water poured in unchecked. By noon, the storm's surge began to recede, but the city was already lost. Levees and flood walls failed in more than 50 places. In less than a morning, 80% of New Orleans was underwater. The collapse wasn't slow or orderly. It happened in a rapid, staccato sequence, wall after wall giving way, neighborhoods vanishing beneath rising water. The city's defenses, built over decades, fell apart in hours. The scale of destruction was almost impossible to grasp. Water surged through streets, filled homes, and erased the boundaries between neighborhoods. The promise of protection vanished with the walls, leaving New Orleans trapped in a disaster that no one had truly believed could happen. Rescue in New Orleans did not arrive as a wave of relief, but as a tide that rose unequal across the city. Uptown, helicopters circled above elegant homes and hospitals, lowering baskets and ferrying patients to safety within hours of the levee failures. In the lower 9th Ward, the water climbed to rooftops and stayed there, trapping families as the hours turned to days. Maria Johnson, a cafeteria worker, spent 48 hours stranded with her grandchildren atop their shotgun house, waving a white bedsheet at passing helicopters that never stopped. The only help came from a neighbor with a battered aluminum boat, who risked the current to bring them to the Claiborne overpass. Official statements insisted that rescue teams were working as quickly as possible, but the numbers told a different story. In Uptown, the majority of residents were reached within the first 24 hours. In the lower 9th, many waited 2 or 3 days. The Convention Center and Charity Hospital, both serving mostly Black and low-income residents, saw delay while resources were diverted to Tulane and private facilities. The city's poorest neighborhoods, already hit by the deepest water, suffered the longest waits. As the days dragged on, the blame began to shift. Governor Kathleen Blanco told reporters that the storm, not human error, was responsible for the devastation. The Army Corps of Engineers echoed this line, arguing that the surge simply overwhelmed the system. But in 2006, the Corps quietly admitted that design flaws and shortcuts had contributed to the disaster. The story of Katrina's aftermath became not just one of broken levees, but of broken promises, where who was rescued first and who was left behind revealed a deeper failure than any breached wall. Cities worldwide still rely on aging levees and wishful thinking. As climate change pushes storms to new extremes, denial becomes the deadliest risk of all. The next disaster won't wait for consensus. The lesson: safety is a choice, one we're still failing to make. What do you think?